The moment Douglas Ferris laughed was the moment Marvella June Calloway understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. She was sitting across from him in a small office at First Cumberland Savings and Loan in Harlan, Kentucky, on a Tuesday morning in late March. The fluorescent light above her hummed like a trapped insect. She had worn her good blouse, the navy one Earl always liked, because she had thought foolishly that it might matter. Douglas Ferris was 52 years old, soft in the jowls, and had the particular manner of a man who had never once been told no by someone who counted. He had set a single sheet of paper on the desk between them and slid it toward her with 2 fingers, as though it were already finished business. It was a foreclosure notice, 30 days. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, folding his hands, "we've been more than patient." She said nothing. She looked at the paper. "Now I understand the situation with Earl was difficult." He said Earl's name the way you might name a piece of machinery that had broken down, but the estate doesn't change the numbers. The numbers are the numbers. She looked up at him. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. On that desk beside the foreclosure notice sat the one thing Earl Calloway had left her that she hadn't understood yet, a small brass key on a plain iron ring, with a paper tag tied to it in Earl's handwriting. 4 words. "For the barn, June." She had carried that key in her coat pocket for 3 weeks, not knowing what to do with it. Douglas Ferris did not notice the key. He had already moved on to talking about market value and outstanding balances, and somewhere behind his words, Marvella heard a sound like a door closing. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what Marvella June Calloway found on the other side of that rusted gate would not only pay off every dollar she owed in this county, it would return to her a version of Earl she had never fully known, in a way that left Douglas Ferris standing with nothing left to say. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marvella June Calloway was born on October 14, 1956 in Cutters Creek, Kentucky, a town small enough that the post office shared a building with the feed store, and everyone in the county knew your mother's maiden name before they learned yours. She was the second of 4 children born to Thomas and Reva Parsons, who farmed tobacco on 42 acres they had held since 1921. Thomas Parsons was a quiet man who worked himself to the bone, never once mentioning it. Reva Parsons was the kind of woman who found something to be grateful for, even on the difficult days, which came with some regularity in Harlan County. Marvella grew up understanding that beauty and hardship could exist in the same moment. She learned to can tomatoes and read library books in the same summer. She graduated from Harlan County High School in 1974, finishing 3rd in her class, and had briefly entertained the idea of going to nursing school in Lexington. But her father's back gave out the summer after graduation, and someone needed to stay. Marvella was the one who stayed. She took a job as a receptionist at the Harlan County Board of Education in the fall of 1975. She was 19 years old. She would hold variations of that same position, receptionist, then administrative assistant, then senior secretary to the district superintendent, for the next 29 years, until she retired in the fall of 2004. She was thorough, quiet, and efficient in ways that the people above her relied upon enormously and mentioned only at retirement parties. She had kept that office running through 4 different superintendents, 2 building relocations, and 1 particularly vicious audit, and she had never once called in sick without actually being sick. She left behind a filing system so precise that the woman hired to replace her called the board office to ask about it, 6 months after Marvella was gone. She had married Earl Roscoe Calloway in June of 1978 in the parking lot of Cutters Creek Baptist Church. Because the building itself was being painted that week and Reverend Hollies said the fumes would give everyone a headache. They said their vows under a maple tree with 17 people watching and a cake Reva Parsons had baked herself. Marvella wore a dress she had made from a simplicity pattern. Earl wore the one suit he owned, which was slightly too short in the sleeves, and he looked at her the whole time like she was the only thing in his field of vision worth attending to. Earl worked, that was the most fundamental thing about him. He had come up in the mines like most men in Harlan County. He started underground at 19 and spent 14 years in the dark before his lungs told him it was time to find another way. He transitioned to surface work, driving heavy equipment for a quarry operation out of Lynch, and later drove a delivery truck for a building supply company in Harlan for 16 years. He was not a man who spoke at length about what he was thinking. He showed it instead, in the way he fixed things around the house without being asked, in the way he put gas in Marvella's car every Sunday morning so she never had to think about it, in the way he sat beside her on the porch every evening when the light went low and said nothing at all, because sometimes the company was enough. They raised their daughter Dina in the white clapboard house on Calloway Road, 14 miles outside of Harlan. The property was 61 acres, most of it wooded hill country that rolled up behind the house into ridgelines where cedar and white oak grew thick. The house itself needed constant tending. The roof leaked in 2 places, the furnace was older than their marriage, and the well pump had been replaced 3 times in 30 years. But it was theirs, and that word carried more weight in Harlan County than most people in other parts of the country could understand. The barn sat at the far edge of the property, 3/4 of a mile from the house, at the end of a dirt lane that climbed through second-growth timber before leveling off into a small clearing. It was a large structure, older than the house, built sometime in the 1920s from hand-hewn timbers, with a tin roof that had gone the color of dried blood and siding boards that had buckled and grayed with decades of weather. There was a gate in front of it, wrought iron, set into a cedar post frame, with a chain looped through it and a padlock that had gone orange with rust. Marvella could not remember ever seeing the barn open. Even as a young woman newly married into the Calloway land, she had asked Earl about it once, and he had said it was just an old storage barn, nothing in it, and she had left it at that. She had not asked again. In 46 years of marriage, there are things you learn to set down. When Earl was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in September of 2022, Marvella drove him to every appointment, filled every prescription, and learned to read the numbers on the monitor they kept by the bed. She did not allow herself to fall apart because there was no room for it. Earl declined slowly and then quickly, the way such things go, and he passed on the morning of March 7, 2024, at home, with Marvella sitting beside him holding his hand. What she discovered in the weeks after his death was that the mortgage on the property, which she had always believed was in reasonable shape, carried a remaining balance of $187,400. Earl had refinanced in 2019, she learned from the paperwork, and had taken additional draws against the equity in 2021 and 2022, years in which his illness had made working impossible and the medical bills had not slowed down. He had not told her. Marvella understood why. She understood it from the inside out, the particular agony of a man who had spent his whole life providing and could not bear to say that he was struggling, but understanding it did not make the number any smaller. Her checking account on March 28, 2024, held $214. Her Social Security income was $1,140 a month. The mortgage payment, now in arrears by 2 months, was $1,019. There was nothing else. It was into this arithmetic that Douglas Ferris arrived. He had been the vice president of lending at First Cumberland Savings and Loan for 19 years. His grandfather had been one of the bank's founding members in 1954, and Douglas carried this fact the way some men carry a family crest, as proof of belonging that required nothing further to demonstrate. He was professionally courteous in the way that people are courteous when they already know how things are going to go. Marvella had met with him twice before that Tuesday in March, when the foreclosure notice appeared. The first meeting had been in late October of 2023, when she had called to ask about options for the arrears that were already accumulating. Douglas had been pleasant that day. He had spoken about the bank's commitment to community, about hardship deferral programs, about sending a formal request in writing, which she did. She received a form letter back 3 weeks later informing her that the account did not qualify for deferral based on the current equity position. The letter was signed with a printed version of Douglas Ferris's name. She called his direct line with a follow-up question and was forwarded to voicemail twice. The second meeting had been in January of 2024, 2 months before Earl died. Earl had insisted on coming with her. He had dressed in his good clothes, ridden in the passenger seat, and walked into that bank on his cane and sat across from Douglas Ferris and said, clearly and without any flourish at all, "We need more time." Douglas had looked at Earl the way people sometimes look at things that are inconvenient. He said he would see what he could do. He did nothing. The third meeting, the Tuesday in late March, was the one with the foreclosure notice and the key. Marvella arrived at 9 in the morning. Douglas kept her waiting 11 minutes in the lobby before his office door opened. She had counted the minutes, not because she was impatient, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "Mrs. Calloway," he folded his hands, "we've been more than patient." She looked at the paper, 30 days, April 28th, the property and all structures contained thereon. "I'd like to know what options exist," she said. Douglas leaned back. At this point, with the balance where it is and the arrears compounded, there isn't a lot of room to maneuver. He said this pleasantly, the way you explain a rule to someone who hadn't quite grasped it. The honest reality is that the property, if it went to market, would likely cover the balance and leave you with something. That's not the worst outcome. I was born on that land, she said. He nodded as though she had made an interesting point that did not change anything. I understand, and I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but the bank has its own obligations. She asked if there was an option to sell a portion of the property rather than the whole. He said the mortgage was held against the entirety of it and that partial sales were complex. He was still pleasant. The pleasantness was the hardest thing to sit across from. She left with the notice in her hand and the key in her coat pocket. She drove home. She made a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the wall. Outside, through the window, she could see the long slope of the back field and the tree line at its edge, and beyond that, somewhere up the ridge, the barn. It was 11:17 in the morning. The light coming through the window was the thin, uncertain light of late March in Kentucky. Marvella looked down at her right hand resting on the table and noticed, for the first time in a long while, the arthritis in her knuckles, the slight swelling there, permanent now, that had begun in her 50s and never resolved. Earl's hands had looked the same way by the end. She thought about that for a while. Then she tucked a loose strand of gray hair behind her left ear, picked up the brass key from where it lay on the table, and read the paper tag again. For the barn, June. He had always called her June when he was being sincere. She put on her coat. She did not tell anyone where she was going. She left through the back door and walked across the field in the direction of the tree line, the key in her fist, the foreclosure notice still on the kitchen table. The backfield was still muddy from the previous week's rain, and her boots pressed down into it with a soft, sucking sound at each step. The air was cold, 43 degrees by the thermometer on the porch, and she felt it in her chest when she breathed. The field was 300 yards of open ground before it met the tree line, and the slope began there. White oak and cedar crowded in close on either side of the old dirt lane, which had been unused long enough that young sycamores had pushed up through its center knee-high, and Marvella had to walk to one side or the other to avoid them. She noticed, passing the fence post at the field's corner, that the bottom rail had pulled loose from its bracket. Without breaking stride, she lifted it and reset it into its slot. She kept walking. She smelled the woods the way she always had, the cold damp of dead leaves, the faint sweetness of cedar, something underneath like iron and wet clay. She could hear a creek somewhere below her to the left, running high with snowmelt. A jay called once from the canopy and then went quiet. The lane climbed for about half a mile. She had not walked it in, she tried to remember, at least 15 years. The grade was gentle until the last 100 yards, where it steepened and curved right around a limestone outcropping, and then the ground leveled into the clearing. She stopped at the edge of it. The barn was bigger than she remembered. She had carried it in her memory as a distant, vague thing, a shape at the far end of their land. But standing 30 yards from it now, she understood how substantial it was. Perhaps 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a gambrel roof that had sagged on the right side where the support timbers had given way. The siding boards were the silver gray of very old wood, some cracked lengthwise, a few fallen away to show the darkness inside. The tin roof above the sagging section had separated at a seam and curled up like the edge of a turned page. The gate was exactly as she remembered, wrought iron, black once, now entirely rust, set between two cedar posts that had been sunk into concrete at some point decades past. A chain was looped through the gate's horizontal bars and secured with a padlock. The padlock was the color of dried tangerine, stiff with oxidation, crusted solid along the shackle. Marvella walked up to the gate. She looked at the padlock for a long moment, then she fitted the brass key into the lock. It did not turn. She tried again. The key went in smoothly enough, but the barrel resisted, frozen with rust inside. She worked it back and forth, carefully, not forcing it, and on the fifth attempt she felt the faintest give, a molecular shift inside the mechanism. She dug in her coat pocket and found the small tin of petroleum jelly she carried for her knuckles, and she worked a small amount of it into the keyhole with the tip of her finger, worked the key again, and this time felt something give way inside. The shackle popped with a sound like a small branch snapping. She unwound the chain. It fell against the post with a ringing clank that seemed very loud in the stillness of the clearing. She pressed the gate open, and it swung on hinges that had been still so long they made no sound at all, just a slow, heavy movement, like something coming awake from a very long sleep. She walked to the barn door. It was a wide sliding door on a rail, large enough to drive a wagon through, secured at the edge with a wooden bar set into two iron brackets. She lifted the bar free and leaned it against the siding. Then she set both hands against the door's edge and pushed. It moved about 8 inches and stopped. She put more weight behind it, and it moved another foot. Then the bottom rail caught on something, a stone had settled into the track, and she worked it free with her boot, and the door slid open another 3 feet, enough to step through sideways. She stepped through. The smell hit her first. It was unlike any barn smell she knew. There was earth in it, deep, rich, complex earth, the kind that takes decades to build, and something green and slightly bitter underneath, something she had no immediate name for. There was no smell of hay, no livestock, no motor oil, none of the ordinary scents she would have expected from a working barn, just that earthen green smell, and beneath it something fainter and sweeter, something almost medicinal. She let her eyes adjust. Light came in through the gaps in the siding in thin, horizontal bars. More light filtered through the separated seam in the tin roof above the sagging section, spreading a faint gray illumination across the barn's interior. Dust moved slowly through it, unhurried, the way dust moves when it has been undisturbed for a very long time. The barn was not empty. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Along the left wall, from front to back, ran rows of wooden shelving, rough-cut lumber, functional and unpretentious, running floor to ceiling and bolted to the wall studs. On the shelving were glass mason jars, hundreds of them, each one labeled in Earl's unmistakable handwriting. She could read the labels from where she stood: year, date, weight, grid location. 2001, 2005, 2009, 2011, 2014, 2016, 2018, 2021. In the center of the barn, 3 long work tables had been built from sawhorses and plywood. On the tables, small hand rakes, soil probes, a digital moisture meter still in its original packaging, 3 pairs of cotton gloves, and a magnifying glass in a leather case. There were composition notebooks, the blackened white marbled kind, perhaps 20 of them stacked in 2 neat piles on the nearest table. A large manila envelope had been set upright against a coffee can that held pencils. The envelope had her name on it. Marvella. Not June, Marvella. She looked at it for a long time without moving toward it. Then she raised her eyes to the back of the barn, where double doors stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the beginning of something that resolved slowly, as her understanding caught up with what she was seeing. She walked to the back doors and pushed them open. Behind the barn, hidden from every direction by the surrounding ridge and the density of the surrounding woods, was a woodland garden that covered what she estimated to be 3 acres or more. It took her breath in a way she had not expected, not because it was ornamental or arranged for beauty. It was neither of those things, but because of the sheer intentionality of it. The area had been cleared of undergrowth and managed beneath a canopy of mature oaks and hickories that had been left standing to provide filtered shade. The ground beneath them had been worked and tended. She could see it in the depth and darkness of the soil, in the rows that followed the natural contour of the hillside, with the care of someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The rows were perhaps 3 feet apart and ran back up the slope for a distance of at least 200 feet. In those rows, the plants grew. She did not know their name yet. What she saw were low, broad-leafed plants, most of them 12 to 18 inches high, growing in clusters with a particular settled quality that spoke of age and long-established roots. Some had the dried stalks of previous years still standing, pale gray against the dark soil. The larger specimens carried clusters of bright red berries even now in late March, the way very old plants sometimes hold onto their fruit through winter. They were evenly spaced. Consistently attended to, growing in something that she understood, even before she knew what they were, had been cared for and protected across a very long span of years. She stood at the back of the barn in the cold air and looked at it. "Earl," she thought, "what did you do?" She went back inside. She did not open the manila envelope, not yet. She walked slowly along the shelving, reading the labels on the mason jars. Each one held dried roots, some pale tan, some darker brown, ranging from small and fibrous to large and knotted specimens that had taken on, over decades of drying, the faintly forked shapes that she could not have known yet were considered indicators of particular age and quality. Each label carried Earl's handwriting, the harvest date, the grid location, the weight at harvest, and a letter number code she did not yet understand. She pulled out her cell phone and began photographing. She photographed every shelf, every label, every row of jars. She photographed the work tables and the tools and the composition notebooks, the spines of them, without opening them, and the manila envelope still standing against the coffee can. She photographed the back doors and the view through them into the garden. She walked the perimeter of the woodland garden and photographed it from 4 directions, from the outermost rows to the oldest plants at the back, from the base of the slope to the canopy line above. She did not touch the plants. She photographed the soil between the rows, the exposed fibrous roots of one specimen where the earth had shifted at the base. She photographed the oldest plants she could find, the ones with the thickest crowns and the widest spread of growth, the ones that looked as though they had been there since before she had thought to look. It was when she was coming back around the left side of the barn that she heard footsteps on the lane. She turned. Rayford Odom came through the gate carrying a can of motor oil in one hand and moving with the deliberate gait of a man who had walked this county his whole life. He was 72 years old, with a face like a topographic map and hands that narrated 31 years underground in the Harlan coal mines without a single word needed. He had been the Calloways' nearest neighbor for 40 years. His property line ran along their west fence, and he had brought food to the house twice since Earl's funeral without being asked and without staying long enough to be a burden. He stopped when he saw her standing there. "Marvella," he looked at the open gate, the open barn door. "You found it." She stared at him. "You know," she said. He turned the motor oil can in his hands. "Earl asked me about 5 years ago to come up here with him once, showed me where things were, asked me to make sure nobody came near it after he was gone until you'd had a chance to come yourself." He paused. "I kept my word on that." She looked at him for a moment. "What is it?" she asked. "The plants." He scratched the back of his neck. "Wild simulated ginseng, American ginseng. Earl started it in '97. I don't know the full of it, but he used to say it was the slowest kind of insurance he could think of." Another pause. "He knew what he was doing, Marvella. I think he knew for a while what the situation was going to be." She looked back at the barn, at the open doors, at the garden visible through them. "I need someone who can tell me what this is worth," she said. Rayford nodded slowly. "I might know who to call." Rayford Odom's nephew was named Curtis, and Curtis worked as a botanical research technician for the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture in Lexington. He was 29 years old, methodical, and had grown up coming to Harlan County for deer season every November, which meant he understood the land and could be relied upon not to talk about other people's business. Rayford had called him that same Thursday evening, and had traded something in that phone call that Marvella would only learn about much later: the Browning rifle he had promised Curtis for his 30th birthday, offered now in exchange for an immediate referral to whoever in the state of Kentucky knew wild simulated ginseng at the level this situation required. Curtis had given Rayford one name: Dr. Celeste Abrams. Dr. Celeste Abrams held a Ph.D. in ethnobotany from the University of Tennessee and had spent 22 years working at the intersection of Appalachian medicinal plants and international export markets. She was 58 years old, based in Berea, Kentucky, and she had testified as an expert witness in 3 significant ginseng authentication cases in the previous decade. She had turned down multiple television appearances on the subject of Appalachian botanicals because she found them reductive. Curtis considered her the only person in Kentucky whose assessment would hold up to any challenge, legal or otherwise. Marvella called her on a Friday morning. Dr. Abrams was quiet on the phone while Marvella described what she had found. She asked 3 questions in succession. How long had the operation been established? Had any of the rootstock been harvested and sold? Was there documentation on site? When Marvella answered 27 years, she did not believe any had been sold. And yes, there were composition notebooks and jars with dated labels going back to 2001. There was a pause on the line. "I can come Monday," Dr. Abrams said. She arrived at 9:30 on a gray April morning, driving a 12-year-old Subaru with a cracked side mirror and a backseat that held 3 canvas bags of equipment. She was a compact woman with short silver-streaked hair and reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and she shook Marvella's hand at the door with the briskness of a person who valued efficiency and had learned that pleasantries were usually just delays. She looked at the photographs Marvella had taken on her phone, scrolling through them slowly, without expression. Then she put her glasses on and said, "Let's go up." Marvella drove them up the lane in the old Ford pickup, which she had not driven in 2 years and which started on the 3rd attempt. They walked through the gate. Dr. Abrams walked ahead of Marvella into the barn and stopped. She went completely still. She stood just inside the door without moving for a full 10 seconds. Her head turned slowly left toward the shelving, then right toward the work tables, then back toward the shelving. Then she said quietly, as if to herself alone, "Lord have mercy." She set her canvas bags on the nearest work table and began removing her equipment: a soil probe, a digital scale, a loop magnifier on a headband, a portable moisture meter, and a camera with a macro lens. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves before she touched anything. She started with the composition notebooks. She read through 3 of them in silence, turning pages with the careful deliberateness of a person reading a primary historical source. Occasionally, she made a small sound, not speech, just the sound of comprehension forming. After 30 minutes, she set the notebooks down, removed her reading glasses, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Your husband kept records," she said, "that I have not seen outside of an academic research institution." She walked to the shelving and selected 3 jars, choosing from different years, different sections of the shelf, and opened them on the work table. The smell that rose from them was the one Marvella had noticed when she first entered the barn, that green and bitter undercurrent, now stronger and more specific. Dr. Abrams used the loupe to examine the roots individually, turning each one in her gloved hands, checking the color at the cross-section, the branching pattern, the size and density of the rootlet structure. She weighed several specimens on the digital scale and noted the figures in her own notebook. Then she walked out to the woodland garden. She walked every row. She did not rush. She stopped at each of the older specimens and crouched to examine them at ground level, her loupe down, her hands moving through the soil very gently around the base of each plant without disturbing them. She probed the soil and read the moisture content at 6 different points across the garden. She photographed from above and from the side. Marvella followed behind her and said nothing. At one plant growing at the highest section of the garden, where the shade was deepest and the soil the darkest, Dr. Abrams crouched for a long time. She examined the evidence of careful soil management around its base. She measured, she photographed. She stood up and turned to Marvella. "This specimen has been in the ground for approximately 25 to 27 years, she said. "I'm reading the root neck. That's the aging structure at the soil line. It's the most reliable indicator we have for wild simulated stock without full excavation." She paused. "Do you know how old American ginseng needs to be before it carries significant market value?" "No," Marvella said. 10 years is the floor for domestic buyers. For Asian export markets, primarily China, South Korea, Hong Kong, 15 years is when the price begins to rise significantly. 25 years is exceptional. Wild harvested roots of this age are protected by law in Kentucky and cannot be legally sold. Wild simulated, which is what this is, planted under natural forest conditions, no irrigation, no chemical inputs, grown in native habitat from certified seed stock. Wild simulated of this age and documentation level is as close to wild as the export market will accept, and it commands nearly the same price. She looked back at the garden. Your husband understood that. Every decision in this operation, the spacing, the canopy management, the soil work, the record keeping, is designed specifically to produce a product that meets wild simulated certification standards for international export. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They returned to the barn. Dr. Abrams spent another hour cross-referencing the composition notebooks with the jar inventory. She estimated the total on-site root stock, dried and living combined, and spoke in figures that she wrote in her notebook as she went. She found a milk crate under one of the work tables that held 3-ring binders, one for each decade, it turned out, in which Earl had printed and organized annual photographs of the garden from a consistent vantage point, going back to 1997. She set down her pen. She removed her gloves. Marvella said, "What is it actually worth?" Dr. Abrams looked at her, the way a person looks when they have decided to be direct, because the alternative is a disservice. "Low end," she said, "if we're conservative about the export authentication process and the market price works against you, $800,000. She paused for exactly one beat. "High end, if the documentation holds up to full certification and you place with the right buyer, $1.4 million. Marvella sat down on the stool at the edge of the work table. She did not say anything. She looked at the jar shelves. She could feel her own heartbeat in a way that was unfamiliar, not racing, but very deliberate, very present, as though calling attention to itself. "Those are real numbers," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I wouldn't offer you any other kind," Dr. Abrams said. "The documentation your husband maintained is going to be the foundation of the authentication. Every jar is dated, every harvest location recorded, every weight noted. He also maintained a photographic record that most commercial operations don't bother with. I have rarely seen this level of thoroughness in a private cultivation of any scale, let alone a one-man operation." She picked up the oldest binder. "He built an evidence case for the value of this before anyone asked him to." Marvella pressed her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the floor. Earl, she thought, Earl. She sat with it, she did not let it go anywhere, she wasn't ready to follow yet. She told herself she would feel all of it later. Right now, there were practical things, and practical things were something she knew how to attend to. She asked Dr. Abrams about the authentication process, the timeline, and the legal requirements for selling wild simulated ginseng in Kentucky. Dr. Abrams answered each question clearly, and then left Marvella with a written preliminary assessment that she said would carry weight in any legal or financial context where it was needed. When Dr. Abrams drove back down the lane, Marvella stood at the barn door for a moment and looked at the jar shelves. Then she walked back through the barn, picked up the manila envelope from where it leaned against the coffee can, and put it carefully in her coat pocket. She walked home. Not yet, she would read it, but not yet. The information reached Douglas Ferris through a path that began with Marvella's attorney. She had retained Patricia Holbrook of Holbrook and Slade in Harlan on the Monday following Dr. Abrams's visit. Patricia was 54 years old and had practiced property and estate law in Harlan County for 27 years, and she was known locally as a woman who did not waste words. Marvella explained everything: the foreclosure notice, the barn, the discovery, Dr. Abrams's preliminary assessment. Patricia listened without interrupting and then said, "I'll need a copy of Dr. Abrams's written assessment and the original mortgage documents. Do not speak to anyone at that bank without me present." Marvella agreed. What she did not account for was the ordinary human permeability of a small county. Patricia's paralegal, a young man named Greg, mentioned the situation in vague but suggestive terms to his girlfriend, who worked at the Harlan County Court Clerk's office, who mentioned it to a cousin at a Wednesday Bible study group that included the wife of a man who did accounting work for First Cumberland Savings and Loan. By the second week of April, Douglas Ferris knew something. He called Marvella on a Tuesday. His voice, when she answered, had warmth in it, a constructed warmth, recognizable as such but carefully applied. "Marvella," he said, "how are you holding up? I've been thinking about our conversation." She said she was fine. "I want you to know," he said, "that the bank's position has never been personal. I've always had a great deal of respect for Earl and for your family. The Calloways go back a long way in this county." A pause precisely timed. "I was wondering if we might sit down again, informally, just to look at the situation fresh and see if there's something we missed." "You can call my attorney," Marvella said, "Patricia Holbrook." There was a beat of silence. "Of course," he said. "Of course, yes. These things can sometimes be resolved more simply than they need to be, without involving." "Patricia Holbrook," Marvella said again. "She'll be glad to hear from you." She ended the call. 3 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail on First Cumberland letterhead. It expressed the bank's continued commitment to working with the estate, referenced a provision in the original mortgage regarding the discovery of significant asset value on the secured property, and suggested, in careful legal language that was nonetheless clearly a threat, that any substantial proceeds from the sale of assets located on the property might be subject to the bank's security interest in the property itself. Patricia read the letter and called Marvella within an hour. "This is a bluff," Patricia said. "A mortgage's security interest does not extend to chattel or agricultural products on that land unless they are specifically enumerated in the mortgage documents, which yours are not. Wild simulated ginseng root is classified under Kentucky law as an agricultural commodity, not as a fixture of the real estate. They have no legal claim to the proceeds." A pause. "He's counting on you not knowing that." "What do we do?" Marvella said. "We proceed with the sale. We pay the mortgage from the proceeds in the correct order and with airtight documentation, so there is no ambiguity about sequence or intent. By the time they try to argue otherwise, it will already be settled." Patricia paused. "Do you want to offer them an early payoff of the full mortgage balance? That closes this faster." "How fast?" 2 weeks, possibly less." "Yes," Marvella said. The process of authenticating and selling the ginseng was more involved than she had anticipated, but Dr. Abrams had given her a clear roadmap before leaving, and Patricia had a colleague in Lexington who had handled agricultural asset sales of this nature before. The root stock was certified through the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife's Wild Simulated Ginseng Program. The documentation Earl had maintained, 27 years of composition notebooks, dated receipts for the original certified seed stock he had purchased from a Moorhead cultivator in 1997, annual photographs organized in 3-ring binders, a precise harvest log for each of the 14 years in which any limited harvesting had occurred, created an authentication record that the buyer's agents described as, in their word, extraordinary. 2 buyers made formal offers. The hire came from an export broker based in Cincinnati, representing a consortium of Asian market buyers. The offer was $1,127,500. Douglas Ferris appeared in person on the 3rd Thursday of April. He drove himself and parked at the end of the lane near the house, and came to the front door wearing his coat buttoned and an expression that was attempting something Marvella could only think of as neighborly. She opened the door. "I was in the area," he said, which was not true. "I thought I'd stop by in person, informally, a smile. Can I come in?" She did not move from the doorway. "No," she said. "Patricia Holbrook will be in touch before the week is out." And she closed the door. She heard his car start and pull away. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She stood at the window and looked at the backfield and the tree line, and thought about Earl walking that lane in the early mornings for 27 years while she slept, and she felt the weight of it spread through her chest like heat from a fire that had been burning a long time without her knowing it was there. The matter of the foreclosure was addressed in Harlan County District Court on April 22nd, 6 days before the deadline. Douglas Ferris had retained a local attorney named Brent Shoemaker, who had filed a motion asserting the bank's security interest in the ginseng proceeds on the theory that rootstock planted and cultivated on secured property constituted an improvement to the real estate and was therefore covered under the mortgage's fixture clause. Patricia had filed her response within 48 hours, citing Kentucky Revised Statutes Chapter 249 and 3 specific case precedents, and had attached Dr. Abrams's full written assessment, the completed certification from the state, and a letter from the buyer's broker confirming the agreed sale amount. Marvella sat at the plaintiff's table in a gray dress she had owned for 12 years and felt, for the first time in many months, entirely calm. She had not slept well the night before, but she had eaten breakfast, and she had brushed her hair, and she had put on the small pearl earrings Earl had given her for their 25th anniversary, and she had driven herself to the courthouse. Judge Wanda Crestfield had presided over Harlan County District Court for 16 years. She was 61 years old and had the measured manner of someone who had heard a great many arguments and was no longer moved by the style of them. Shoemaker presented the bank's position first. He argued that the ginseng cultivation, having been established on the secured property across 27 years, had become integral to the land's character and value, and that the mortgage's security interest extended to it accordingly. He cited 2 cases from other states, neither of which involved agricultural products or Kentucky statutes. He spoke for 18 minutes. Patricia presented for 11. She cited Kentucky Revised Statutes 249.575, which specifically addresses wild harvested and wild simulated ginseng as an agricultural commodity under the law. She cited First National Bank of Henderson v. Meridian Grain, 1987, in which a Kentucky court ruled that growing crops do not constitute real property fixtures absent specific contractual language. She submitted the full text of the Callaway mortgage, in which the word ginseng did not appear, nor did any language addressing growing agricultural products. She submitted Dr. Abrams's assessment as Exhibit C and the state authentication certificate as Exhibit D. She did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She was finished before anyone expected her to be. Then Shoemaker raised a secondary argument. He said he felt the court should be made aware that Mrs. Callaway, during the period in which the bank had been seeking resolution, appeared to have deliberately withheld knowledge of a significant asset, specifically, that she had not disclosed the ginseng operation during her meetings with the bank's representatives. Patricia responded without pausing. Mrs. Callaway was not aware of the existence of the ginseng operation until after she received the foreclosure notice. This has been documented in Dr. Abrams's assessment, which specifically notes that Mrs. Callaway had never entered the barn in question during her 46 years on the property. The allegation of concealment has no factual basis, and the bank has not produced a single document suggesting Mrs. Callaway had any prior knowledge of this asset. She paused for exactly 1 beat. Furthermore, the bank's only formal communication with Mrs. Callaway over the preceding 18 months consisted of a form denial letter and 2 in-person meetings. At no point did the bank conduct a property assessment of its own. It is not the debtor's obligation to perform the bank's due diligence on the bank's behalf. Marvella did not look at Douglas Ferris during this exchange, but she glanced at him once when it was over. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had run a long distance and arrived at a finish line he had not intended to reach. For one moment, only one, she felt something that was adjacent to pity, something that understood what it was to have spent a long time performing a version of yourself and find it insufficient. Then the moment passed, and she looked back at the judge. Judge Crestfield ruled that ginseng root stock, whether dried or living, cultivated under wild simulated conditions on privately held land, constituted an agricultural commodity under Kentucky statute and did not fall under the mortgage's security interest. She ruled that the bank's foreclosure proceeding could continue on its original terms, the mortgage balance remained due, but that the ginseng sale proceeds were the sole property of the estate of Earl Roscoe Calloway, to be distributed to his surviving spouse, Marvella June Calloway, as sole heir. She recommended that the parties proceed immediately to settlement. The settlement was executed 4 days later in Patricia's conference room. The mortgage balance of $187,400 was paid in full from the ginseng sale proceeds. Shoemaker sat across the table and signed the satisfaction of the mortgage with the face of a man completing routine paperwork. He did not make eye contact. Douglas Ferris was not present. After all fees, Patricia's full representation, Dr. Abrams's complete assessment, the authentication costs, the broker's commission, Marvella June Calloway received a wire transfer to her account on April 26, 2024, in the amount of $1,089,340. She was sitting at her kitchen table when the transfer cleared. She had her laptop open to her online banking because Patricia had told her to watch for it. She saw the number appear in her balance field. She closed the laptop. She sat with it for a moment. Then she put on her coat, picked up the manila envelope from the counter where it had been sitting for 3 weeks, and went outside. She walked across the backfield, through the tree line, up the lane, through the gate, and through the barn. She walked through the back doors and out into the garden, and she kept walking until she was standing at the far edge of it, where the oldest specimens grew in the deepest shade, where the ridge curved around above her and the trees were tall, and the late afternoon light came down through the canopy in long, falling shafts. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. She unfolded it. Earl's handwriting, the careful, slightly cramped handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write neatly because he believed neatness was a form of respect, filled the page. Dear Marvella, if you're reading this, then I did not get the chance to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. I have been trying to find the right time for going on 6 years now, and I have come to understand that there was never going to be a right time, because this is the kind of thing a man does quietly or he doesn't do at all. I started planting in the spring of 1997. You remember that spring? It was the year Dina had the chicken pox, and we couldn't take the trip to Gatlinburg we'd been planning. I drove to Moorhead to get the seed stock from a man who had been cultivating for 15 years and knew what he was doing. It cost me $400 that I told you was for a new alternator on the truck. That lie has bothered me for 27 years, and so I am confessing it here. I read everything I could find. I kept records from the first day. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to say it was worth something until I knew for certain, and by the time I knew for certain, the amount seemed like the kind of thing that would scare you if I said it the wrong way. I want to tell you why I did it. You remember the summer of 1976, before we were married. We used to walk down to the swimming hole on Cutter's Creek, the one below the Parsons property line. You'd sit on the limestone shelf with your feet in the water and read while I fished. I can still see you there. You had that yellow blouse you wore most of those afternoons, and you'd tuck your hair behind your ear when you were concentrating, and the light would come through the sycamores the way it does in late afternoon, that particular way, where it turns everything the color of something just about to happen, and I used to think I was the luckiest man who had ever stood on this ground. I always felt behind on what I wanted to give you, behind on what I knew you deserved. You never made me feel that way, not once, not in 46 years, but I felt it on my own, and this was my answer to it. 27 years of walking up that lane before you woke, and it was never a hardship. It was the best work I ever did with my hands. The land is yours. Everything on it is yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You were always the one who stayed. I want you to know I understood what that cost, and I was grateful for it every single day we had. I love you, June. I always will. Take care of the lights. She read it twice. She stood in the garden in the late afternoon in the long shafts of light coming through the canopy, that particular light, the color of something just about to happen, and she held the letter in both hands and felt the full weight of it arrive. She did not cry, not there. That would come later, alone in the house, in the particular privacy she had always kept for the feelings that mattered most. What she felt standing there was not grief exactly. It was something larger and older than grief. It was the feeling of being known by someone who was no longer present to know you and finding that it held. She stood in the garden for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it inside her coat, closed. She walked home through the turning cold of the late afternoon, the gate swinging shut behind her, her boots quiet on the gravel of the lane. By October of 2024, 6 months after the settlement, the Calloway property looked like what it had always been, a place that mattered deeply to someone. The roof of the house had been replaced in August by a crew from Harlan who spent 10 days up there in the late summer heat. Marvella had chosen standing seam metal in dark green, the kind that would outlast her, and she hoped, whoever came after. The furnace had been replaced. The well pump, limping on borrowed time for 2 years, had been upgraded to a new submersible system that ran so quietly she sometimes forgot it was working. The porch boards had been replaced one by one with treated cedar, and she had done most of that work herself over 4 weekends, because she wanted to. The railing that Earl had always meant to tighten, the one she had pushed against every evening for years, feeling the give in it, was now solid enough to lean your full weight on without a thought. She had the dirt lane graded and graveled from the house all the way to the barn, a quarter-mile of road that had never been more than ruts in intention. She hired a carpenter from Loyal to restore the barn's siding and replace the failed purlins in the sagging section of the roof, and she kept the tin the same, aged and dark, the color of the land it sat on, because it seemed wrong to make it look new. The gate she had oiled and rehung on new hardware, but she kept the original iron. It still swung heavy and deliberate, the way things do that have been standing a long time. The woodland garden was now under a management agreement with the University of Kentucky Extension Program, which provided ongoing technical guidance for the remaining living root stock. Marvella had elected not to harvest everything at once, a decision Dr. Abrams had quietly supported, keeping the oldest specimens in the ground as what she thought of, privately, as witnesses to what had been built there. She walked up to the garden on Tuesday and Friday mornings, which was when Earl had walked up, as she had learned from his notebooks. She brought his tools. She performed the maintenance he had written instructions for, in his handwriting, in the composition notebooks she had read from cover to cover twice. The first thing she had done with the money, before the mortgage was paid, before the roof, before anything practical at all, was establish a small educational endowment at Harlan County High School in Earl's name, $40,000, earmarked for students pursuing agriculture, botany, or environmental science. It carried his name on a brass plaque in the school's main hallway, the Earl Roscoe Calloway Fund for Students of the Land. She had chosen that language herself. She thought he would have found the rest of it embarrassing, but he might have accepted that. In August, she had driven to Moorhead and found Orville Bench, the man who had sold Earl the original certified seed stock in 1997. He was 81 now, a retired schoolteacher with a porch full of houseplants and a memory like a ledger. He remembered Earl without hesitation when she said the name. 300 seeds, he said, and a folded paper of handwritten cultivation notes. He had wondered about that over the years, whether it had taken. Marvella told him how it had taken. Orville Bench sat back in his kitchen chair and was quiet for a moment. He came back once, Orville said finally, about 10 years in, just to tell me the stand was healthy. He didn't want anything. He just wanted me to know it had taken. She drove home from Moorhead in the early evening with the windows down and the radio off and the late summer air coming through the car. And she thought about a man who drove 4 hours round trip just to let someone know that what they had started together had not died. She had paid for a new rifle for Curtis without being asked and had it delivered to Rayford's house with a note that said only, "Thank you for keeping your word." Rayford had called her and said it was nothing. She had said it was nothing. They left it at that. On a Friday morning in mid-October, a morning with the particular quality of Kentucky autumn, when the light seems to come from inside the leaves rather than from above, Marvella walked up to the barn. She wore her work boots and her old canvas coat and carried Earl's green thermos, filled with coffee she'd made before dawn. She went through the gate, which swung smoothly now, and through the barn and out the back doors. She stood in the rows. The ginseng plants had turned gold at their edges, and the berries on the oldest specimens were red as embers against the yellowing leaf litter. The hillside above her was a wash of amber and copper under the canopy. The air smelled like dying leaves and the particular earth of this place, rich and dark and slightly sweet in a way she had learned to name but would never fully describe. She sat on the old three-legged stool Earl had left beside the back door, and she drank her coffee, and she looked at what he had built. She was 67 years old. She had been born 2 miles from where she was sitting. She had stayed when staying was hard and asked for very little in return, and had, for most of her adult life, accepted the arithmetic of other people's expectations as something to endure rather than negotiate with. She did not think of herself as a woman who had won anything. But she thought about a man who answered love the way a craftsman answers a commission, with his hands, with his time, with a patience that outlasted everything else. She thought about 27 years of early mornings, and a lane she had never walked, and a garden she had never seen, and a letter she now carried folded in the breast pocket of every coat she owned. She tucked a loose strand of gray hair behind her left ear. She finished her coffee. She set the thermos on the stool and walked the rows slowly, the way she always did on Fridays, checking the plants that Earl had asked her in his notebooks, in his handwriting, to keep an eye on. They were fine. They were exactly as they should be. The light came through the canopy in long, falling shafts, that particular light, the color of something just about to happen, and she walked in it, unhurried, attending to what was hers. Some things in this life are not given loudly. They are placed somewhere you haven't thought to look yet, and they wait there patiently, quietly, for as long as it takes, and when you finally find them, they tell you everything about the person who left them for you, and nothing at all about luck. Marvella June Calloway walked home that October morning, carrying an empty thermos and a heart full of evidence. The debt was gone, the land was whole. Earl's name was on a wall in a school in Harlan County. The gate swung smoothly now. The rest of it was just what happened after she used the key.